Asia is home to some of the richest biodiversity hotspots in the world. However, the region is also experiencing rapid biodiversity loss due to climate change and human activities. According to recent projections, as much as 42% of all species in Southeast Asia could be lost by the turn of the century, and at least half of these would be global extinctions. Nature loss in the region will in turn profoundly damage economic activities. Recent reports suggest that as much as 63%, that's 19 trillion USD, of Asia Pacific's GDP is at risk, a higher share than the global average. So as countries work on new solutions, what role do data and technologies like AI have in slowing down the decline of our natural ecosystems? What are the challenges and risks, and how might we address this in Asia? Hello and welcome to Code Green, a podcast series where we explore the intersection of climate change and artificial intelligence in Asia. I'm Urvishya Neja, the founder and director of Digital Futures Lab, an India-based research organization that examines the impact of technology on society in the global south. Through evidence-based research, systematic foresight, and public engagement, we work to realize equitable, safe, and sustainable digital futures for all. This podcast is accompanied by a monthly newsletter where we showcase the latest scientific and socio-technical research at the intersection of AI and climate action. You can access both the podcast and our newsletter at codegreen.asia. Code Green is supported by Earth Venture Foundation, a not-for-profit initiative that supports scientific research to advance climate action. In today's episode, we are joined by conservationists Eleanor Slade and VV Robin, whose research sits at the intersection of ecological changes and technology use across Malaysia and Borneo, Singapore, and India. This was a fascinating conversation which made me rethink some of my assumptions about AI and climate action. Eleanor and Robin highlighted AI's potential to enhance ecological monitoring and species observation across diverse habitats. We also talked about how technology has aided citizen science initiatives and how it can help foster a stronger bond between people and nature. But the conversation also reminded me of how similar the challenges are in using AI for advancing social good, regardless of the social sector or social problem we are discussing. AI can have a catalytic role, but on its own, no matter how advanced, it's not enough. In the case of AI for conservation, we need more scholars and scientists who have a deep understanding of our natural environment and species, and we have to invest in foundational scientific research. We can't leapfrog these basics, but if we get these basics right, technologies like AI can have a transformative role in protecting biodiversity. Let's jump right in and hear from Eleanor and Robin. Eleanor Robin, thank you so much for joining me. It's such a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with both of you. I work in tech policy, and it's such a breath of kind of fresh air to be having this conversation around conservation, which is just not something that comes up in the normal kind of tech policy circles that I'm a part of. So I'm really excited to learn from you both, and also to be able to share the work that you do with our listeners. So maybe to kick it off, it would be great to know a little bit about both your work. Eleanor, maybe I can start with you. What are the key drivers of biodiversity loss in the research context that you work on, and what are the kind of issues that you're trying to solve for in your work?
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me onto the show today. So my name is Eleanor Slade, and I'm an associate professor at the Tropical Ecology and Entomology Lab at the Asian School of the Environment at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And our lab works on the drivers of biodiversity decline. So we're looking at the impacts of land use change and climate change on biodiversity, but we focus mostly on insects and invertebrates. And so insects and invertebrates face particular challenges. They're a hyper-diverse group of animals. So lots and lots of species, a lot of them occur in high abundances. And particularly in the tropics, we have many species that are not described yet even to science. So monitoring those species and figuring out how they're affected by these drivers and of decline is very important when you have these groups that are so diverse and yet so little is known about them.
Thanks, Eleanor. And Robin, similarly, I'd love to just get a brief intro to your work. Tell us about the areas that you work in and what is the kind of problem that you're solving for.
Yeah, I'm Robin, VV Robin, or Robin Vijayan, and I am an associate professor at this institute called Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in Tirupati, or ISER for short. And I'm primarily an ecology, evolutionary biologist, and I work on birds, mostly on the evolution of birds, the impacts of isolation of habitats. And on that spectrum, I look at speciation and also on extinction. So I am really excited to also hear about Eleanor's work because I can see the parallels with landscape change and climate change, which is also something that we look at. But only difference is that ours probably has a more like an evolutionary context because we are also looking at how species are created, how are these populations different in terms of songs and bird songs particularly. And that is where our interface with AI comes in.
Thank you both for sharing that. We produce this newsletter called Code Green, which you must have seen. And when we were doing our research on AI for conservation, it seemed that digital technology has become quite integral to conservation work for a couple of decades now. And so I'd love to know a little bit more about how you both use tech and AI in your work, and what is kind of data collection in this space looks like, and what role specifically does AI play? And Eleanor, we could once again start with you.
Sure. So I think over the recent few years, we've heard a lot about declines in biodiversity, and particularly in the last few years, declines also in insect populations. So it was reported quite widely in the news. I think we might have heard of things like the insect Armageddon, insect apocalypse happening. And what we found for insects was a lot of this data was based on data from temperate regions, and that very little was known about whether these patterns of decline were happening in the tropics. We just didn't have the data to show that. So, of course, we know that biodiversity is declining, and we know that we have huge land use change and climate change impacts in the tropics. So we expect that this will be affecting insects, but we didn't have the actual data to really show what was happening in insect populations and which species were increasing, which species were decreasing, what was happening here. So one of the things that we really need to find out is how we can monitor these vast numbers of species of insects that we have. And this is where I think automated systems and technology and AI can really play a very important role in this, because it's very hard to go out and monitor hundreds of thousands of moth species and beetle species all in one go. So one of the projects that we are working on is a project with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and the Turing Institute in the UK. And this project is to monitor nocturnal insects, so things like moths that fly at night. And they can be attracted to these traps that have a light source to them, and the moths are attracted to the traps and they land on a whiteboard at the back. And then a camera is photographing and videoing these moth species. And this data is loaded up into SD cards and then can be analyzed at a later date. And so we don't have to harm the insects to do this. We don't need to collect them. We can just photograph them, and then we can use AI tools to try and identify them.
Right. So in some sense, then what you're using is some kind of like computer vision AI systems or something to be able to recognize these insects or categorize them?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the big challenge that we have. It all sounds very good, right? And these systems have been tested in temperate regions where we have far fewer species and we have very good data on those species. So we have lots of photos. So the problem, in a sense, with these AI systems is they need to be trained to recognize these species. And so you need to have fed that AI system with previous photographs, and you need to have experts who are telling the AI system, like, okay, this is this species, this is this, you're correct, you're wrong, and you need to train it the same way that we train, for example, face recognition in airports or for the police force. And so the problem that we have in the tropics is that we're collecting all these photographs, but we don't know what species they are. So we haven't had photographs in the past to be able to train that AI system for it to be able to identify them. And of course, we also have this problem that we have a real dearth of natural historians, taxonomists, entomologists who can identify these systems and can train the AI system. So the first thing that we really need to do now is to actually get these photographs together, train some experts and train this AI system then to be able to identify these photos. But hopefully in the future, the idea is that this will work as it does in places like the UK or the US. And then, yes, it will go through this system and it will be able to say, okay, yes, this is this species, this is this, and it'll be able to spit this out at a very rapid pace, much more rapid than an individual person could do. But we're not quite there yet for the tropics, I think.
And do you see those kind of investments being made already by like maybe government or academia in terms of then training the experts to be able to train the AI systems, or really like bridging that gap in some sense between the scientific knowledge needed to create these more advanced AI systems?
I think it's coming. When I talk, there's a lot of emphasis, there's a lot of focus on the AI systems and on these models and on this tech, right? And that's where the investment is. And everyone's like, oh, we can put out these systems and we can do this, and that is very exciting, and it is really going to help us monitor biodiversity. But I think at the moment, there's still not sometimes that awareness that, oh, but actually, first of all, we need to go back and we need to have the basic natural history of these species, the taxonomy. We need to describe them. We need to know what's out there. And we need to be training the next generation of students, of entomologists who are able to identify these species and are not just tech people sitting behind computers. So the tech is great and it can really help us, but what we really need also is this recognition that, first of all, particularly in the tropics, we need basic biodiversity data, we need basic natural history, and we need to be training the next generation. And I think those are conversations that are only just starting to happen. There's been all the focus on the tech and not so much on what we actually need to make that tech really work for us, I think.
That's such an important point, and I think you also articulated it so well that we can't skip over that step, that we still need that expertise and those knowledge systems to even be able to train these AI systems. Robin, maybe I could turn to you now. A significant part of your work is on ecology of birds and bioacoustics. And so what motivated you to explore the intersection of bioacoustics and AI?
Yeah, so I think first I'd like to kind of agree with a lot of the points that Eleanor made, although it was with a different, it was not acoustics, but more based on photographs and computer vision. I think the challenges remain the same. Ideally, we would like to have a system that is well trained, but the problem is that in many places, for example, I'll give you some examples. The species that I work on is called the Sholicola. It's one of our target species. We work on a lot of birds, but this species is found only on some mountain tops in the Western Ghats at the highest elevations. And the songs were not even well described earlier when I started my research on this bird. And it was the songs that got me to start thinking about maybe the birds on different mountains are different. And then I followed that up with genetic data. And I found that they are actually different, and they are, 5 million year old divergence between these mountains, which are actually quite close by. So I think the acoustics actually play a very big role in diversity, biodiversity, and birds are very popular in most parts of the world, especially in India. But very little attention is paid to this to the songs, to studying bird songs. And this is something that I've been focusing on. Once we started, analyzing the data about these birds and figuring out that the songs on different mountains are different, we also, started realizing that we don't know when these birds breed. When do they sing? Because birds only sing when they are breeding. And the breeding cycle has a very strong connection to climate change, to climate, and hence to climate change. And so we wanted to know across a gradient where there is, although the mountains are small, there's a gradient of rainfall. So if we want to know across this mountain when are birds breeding, actually we don't have the data. In fact, we probably don't have the data for most species of birds, but for the bird that we were looking at, we did not have this data. And the only way to do that is to then put out these recorders, because you cannot be at multiple places at the same time. And similarly, we started looking at the impact of landscape change. There's a lot of invasive species in the landscape that we work on, and we wanted to see how birds occupy various, stages of invasion. And again, it was not possible to be at all of these places at the same time. Automated recorders really helped. And this is where we hit the next challenge, which is the AI. And Eleanor just nailed it, because she just, described exactly the problem that we face. There are very good algorithms. In the initial parts of my research, I was working with people in the, in the technology domain, with engineers, especially speech, kind of working on speech models. And they were trying to help me build some of these models for specific species of birds. And we quickly realized that this is a much larger challenge than we imagined. So after about 4 years of trying, I mean, I kind of decided to step back from trying anymore. And fortunately, there are other global models now that do fairly well. There's one called BirdNet, which works very well for most species of birds, except it doesn't work for birds in the Western Ghats. It doesn't work for the birds that I study on. So it's great that there are these models, somebody is building them, but it's still not, it's not plug and play. There's so much more that needs to go to develop this. We have in fact used some of these models to also detect rare endangered birds. Two of my colleagues joined hands with another NGO and tried to find a bird called the Jordan's courser. This was last found maybe 20 years back. But one of our collaborators had a recording of the bird from when he last saw it. So we used that to then set out recorders in all of the areas where this bird was thought to be found, and we did find one, call of the bird. We haven't found the bird yet, but at least we know that, there is hope. So there's a lot of applications that are possible. Another student of mine works in the marine space, where she has arrays of recorders trying to detect marine mammals like dolphins, which we can't count otherwise. But using these, she's able to kind of estimate densities, not just whether they are found, but how many are there. So it's pretty exciting time, and I'm really happy to be in this space, working on these questions as the technology develops. With more, we'll understand about the biodiversity, I suppose.
It's so interesting in the parallels of in both of what you're saying, right? Like in some sense, the problem is really starts from at the data level. That do we even have the right data sets that we need for the context that we're working in? And Robin, for a lot of conservation work, citizen science plays an important role, especially in that kind of ground data collection and validation, especially in contexts where you have which are data scarce contexts. So do you see citizen science playing a role here, or how has the role of citizen science evolved in the past few years? And again, does technology have a role in kind of accelerating that engagement or the involvement of citizen science?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, I think there are. I want to answer this at two levels. First is that I think citizen science is definitely a really big opportunity that is there in bridging this, this gap of how much data there exists. Again, the example that I have from the bird world is this, what we talked about, BirdNet, and there's another one app called Merlin, both from the Cornell team, and both of them actually are developed on data which were collected by citizen scientists. eBird and various other platforms where people have been recording and uploading data, and that is the backbone of much of the algorithms that have been developed so far and are working fairly successfully. Of course, the limitation is, where citizen scientists go, and hence, there is reduced representation from many of the inaccessible areas or, even from India, parts of India, and so on. So I think there's definitely an opportunity there. But I would also like to highlight that there's a little bit of a challenge, because while some things are scalable, data quality is something that we need to keep an eye on. How the data is curated. Some of the platforms are kind of robust, and they consider this. But I think that this is something that needs to be a little bit of curation, because as we go along, we just need to be careful that we are actually getting the data that we want. In India, I feel the challenges for citizen science and the access and penetration to go into smaller towns and villages, where people are actually closer to biodiversity. In the big cities, I think you will already find fairly good representation, but it's the small towns and villages that are the kind of at the forefront, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about kind of being able to verify what comes in from citizen science is a really interesting and important point. And I think that a general kind of a recurring theme we see even the broader idea of kind of participation, right? We want participation in whether it's technology development or conservation processes or both these coming together, but we also need to make sure that the participation is in some sense of a certain standard or a certain quality, or is kind of measurable or has the same kind of parameters that it's working with. Eleanor, I wanted to come back to something that you'd said in your kind of opening remarks. That we know that there's a lot of biodiversity loss, but what we haven't had is the actual data to show that biodiversity loss, the extent of that biodiversity loss, or the nuance of that biodiversity loss. And so that's I mean, and I hope I'm paraphrasing you correctly, but that's one of the ways in which AI plays an important role in then actually collecting and building that database. And that kind of resonates with this idea that I think has become quite popular even in policy making, that we need more data-driven policy making, right? So we need more better data so we can drive policy making. But in some of the circles that I work in, I've also seen that, actually going from good data and then being able to use that data to influence policy is a separate endeavor in itself, right? And I was wondering if you had any reflections on that. Like once we have that data, once we build that data, what is then the path towards then being able to actually use that data to be able to drive the kind of policy making we'd want to see to preserve or protect biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe come back to your first statement about that we don't have the data to show that we have biodiversity loss. I think we do have data to show that there is global biodiversity loss on big scales, and a lot of that data particularly comes from the vertebrates. So it comes from the birds and the mammals and the bigger things that we can measure and that we've measured a lot over time. So for sure, there definitely is biodiversity loss, and we do have data to show that. But for the invertebrate groups, the smaller groups, for example, that I work on, and for some groups, like, for example, in the seas that are more difficult to measure, some of the invertebrates in the seas, we don't have that data. So specifically for things like insects, that data is very, very lacking. For tropical regions, for temperate regions, we have much better data. So I just wanted to clarify that we definitely, I mean, the IPBES report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, very clearly highlights data driven evidence that there is biodiversity decline globally, but it's lacking for certain groups. It's based on birds or mammals.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, and I'm glad you clarified that for our listeners. That is what I meant as well, that for certain aspects we don't have that data, but I was just trying to think through, what it takes from having good data to then being able to use that data to influence policy and influence the kind of change that we might want to see.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, scientists are great, right, at collecting data and writing scientific papers and publishing it in scientific journals and then going, okay, well, we've done that. And then, but who's picking up those scientific journals and who's reading that and who has access to those as well? So I think there's definitely a very big role for scientists to play in making sure that their data is actually making its way out into reports and into policy. And either, some scientists want to do that themselves and are great at doing that, but there's also a role for other sort of bodies that can help with translating the science into policy or translating the science into briefs that can be used for policymakers. So an example that I have is I work a lot in Malaysian Borneo in Sabah. And there we work with an agency, an NGO called the Southeast Asian Rainforest Research Project. And this program works a lot with scientists to sort of be the middle person to help translate the science so that it is available for government agencies. And so, for example, we were working a lot with them looking at riparian areas and how wide does a riparian area need to be to help provide connectivity through the landscape, so to help to connect up these patches within oil palm plantations. And so the scientific evidence from scientists that have monitored lots of different aspects of biodiversity through plants and mammals to insects showed that actually, if you increase the riparian widths from the 20 meters legal width to 40 meters, that this would help maintain the biodiversity within that landscape and help to provide these connectivity corridors through the landscape. But enable for that to be made into policy, we can't just publish this in our scientific papers. So the role there is to produce policy briefs, to produce animations, to have people who go and engage with policymakers on the ground. And of course, to also work with local communities and local people on the ground, because if you've got some scientific evidence, you can't just say, okay, well, now you just need to give up your land and put in these corridors. And, so there needs to be engagement at all these different levels if you want your science to be sort of help to inform policy as well. So I think it's very important role for scientists to recognize that they need to do more to communicate their science or to work with certain groups or certain people to help that communication of science and to really also to work with local communities and local people on the ground as well. It's not just about sort of sitting in our ivory towers and publishing this and saying, okay, we know best, so this is what you should be doing.
Yeah, and I wonder whether there's a role that AI can play in that as well, in terms of kind of science communication, whether it's in terms of kind of storytelling or simplifying complex kind of studies into simpler language, translating it into different languages, visualizing it for different communities, etc. I was part of a workshop recently on AI and climate action in the Indian context, and saw some really interesting examples where this group had used kind of new Gen AI tools to be able to help a local organization do storytelling in a more effective manner, which otherwise they would not have. I mean, it's not that they were not doing it, but then they were able to now do it in a language that spoke to a policymaker or spoke to a funder. So even on that end, on the kind of science communication, I think there might be some interesting use cases or some interesting potential as well.
I also wanted just to mention, to come back to Robin's point, I think, or about the citizen science end and engaging people. So the other example is iNaturalist, which is a brilliant platform for people just to go out with. Now people have phones all the time, right? So you can just go out and you take a photo and you upload that photo, and then experts go onto that and they identify those photos for you, and you can sort of have your collection of photos and see these sort of coming together, but these are also feeding into these big databases that are then used by science and scientists. So the Global Biodiversity Information Facility pulls from iNaturalist as well, the verified records, and it uses this to map biodiversity. And the GBIF, the Global Information Facility, is where we get a lot of our data on what species are doing and if they're increasing or decreasing. And a lot of this data actually comes from citizen scientists who are now just using the technology on their mobile phones. And of course, all these apps that are being developed to help people sort of just scan it, and then you can see what butterfly it is or what tree it is. And this engagement with nature, I think also there's the problem sometimes that people disengage with nature, or they find nature scary. Or so to use these technologies now, the AI that we could just get on our phone, actually to help people get engaged with nature again, and also to help them record nature that then can be used by scientists as well. So I think it's a very important point as well. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that AI has done, is that it's broken these barriers for the first exposure to nature, I would say. For example, with iNaturalist, in some of the groups that I have kind of interacted with, people who are totally disengaged from nature, you just take them out, and then, initially they're a little skeptical, they start taking photos, and then once they kind of, they start getting some IDs coming up. And this happens with iNaturalist with the photographs, or with Merlin, this app from Cornell, which does it with bird song. You can, it gives you some live detection, and people, their faces light up. They say, "Oh, this is the bird that I'm listening to," and then the next time they may not need the app, because they are able to make that connection themselves, and they're able to say, "Oh yeah, this is that bird that I heard earlier, which was detected." So I think that there is a definitely, it's breaking down some barriers at the first use. Like as an introduction to nature, it's very strange that the bird is here, but you have to look at your phone to connect to that. But it works, so I'm not complaining. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, these are such interesting kind of use cases that, in the space of kind of tech policy that I work in, and where we do a lot of work on the kind of use of AI in public administration, welfare. What we often end up finding is more worrying kind of use cases, right? Whether it's for determining welfare eligibility or being used in the judicial system. And so it's really interesting to think about what you both are saying, that in some sense, we can actually use these technologies to also deepen that interaction with nature, or build that understanding, or build a conversation between people who wouldn't otherwise be engaged with nature, and get them to start thinking about these things. So that's a really kind of optimistic, forward looking, I think, use case. But I want to also at the same time, use this moment to maybe like touch on some of the tensions in this space. And Robin, maybe this is something that I could ask you, that, there is a tension between kind of conservation practices and also how humans interact with the natural environment. So, for an example, declaring a site as protected can then also displace local communities who might use that space for their livelihoods. In the context of AI, we see this tension quite clearly. So even for AI growth, we're going to, the kind of resource extraction, the climate impacts of AI are also very real. So as your experience as a researcher, as working in this field, how do you think about this tension between kind of conservation and economic development, to put it very loosely?
Yeah, this is a tough one, and I wish Eleanor was going before me this time as well. But yeah, no, I mean, there's no escaping this. I mean, there are, as every time, I suppose, societies come up with newer technologies or newer ways of doing things. There's always there are two sides to it, and I think there's a lot written about this. I personally don't have experience with AI, by itself. But I do understand, protected areas and people. India has some leadership with its large population and then abundant wildlife. So definitely the interface between this is very real, and I think AI has a big role to play. The interesting thing is, of course, that coexistence is very real in India, and I think, Urushi, you know this. I mean, because there are elephants walking through people's farms, and leopards behind, uh, 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 where people are going, kids are going to school and things like that. And this is very, it's being practiced. Now the question is, how does AI come in and help make things better? I think there are people who are working on some clever early warning systems, whether it was bioacoustics or visual-based AI models. The That, I think, is the positive side of it. I'm not sure about the economic challenges and sustainability issues. For example, I'm sure all of you know about the water conservation issues with AI usage and things like that. I don't know enough about that. So I think those are common challenges that are there. Um, And then, of course, there are these certain polarized options, I would say, about how these AI training models are built, which representation and things like that. So those things are very real. But I think in terms of biodiversity, if we focus on at least some of the positives, there do seem to be some challenges that can be addressed in this tension in conservation practice. That's what I would say.
Eleanor, anything you want to add?
I mean, I guess at the local level, some of the discussions I've been having recently at some workshops that I was at was around, we do have to be mindful about the environmental impacts of our expansion into tech and AI. So, things like, for example, the lithium batteries that we need to use in our acoustic recorders or our camera traps and things like this. And the amount of data that we're actually collecting. So there's this, because it's so easy in a way now to collect the raw data, we put these things out and we'll just okay, well, we'll just collect and we'll collect and we'll collect, and then we'll store it, and then we'll try and figure out what we're going to do with it. And I think we need to think a bit more carefully about what are the questions we're actually asking with this tech, and how are we going to do this, and how can we do this in a more kind of environmentally friendly way. So do we actually need to be collecting all this data? I mean, I've done it myself. We put out our recorders and they've been running for, the whole morning. And then we collect this data and then we go, actually, we can't really analyze it all because we don't have the computing power and we don't have. So we take the first minute of every 15 minutes or something and we just use that. But we've been running all these recorders for vast amounts more time, and this has cost us in terms of the number of lithium batteries we need to use, the amount of storage space, the amount of processing space, which all have environmental impacts. So trying to think a bit more about what do we actually need. If we just set the recorder to record 1 minute every 15 minutes, then that's going to lengthen the amount of time we use our batteries for. It's going to reduce our storage space. So I think there are things that we can do on kind of smaller scales, and we're going to have to start doing. We can't just keep collecting massive amounts of data and storing it in this way, right? So, I mean, across all sorts of levels, people are going to have to start to think about what are we actually storing? What do we actually need? What do we... But we've sort of come into this very enthusiastically, which is great. And I think now we're at a stage where we actually have this data. So we can also start testing. We can do comparisons on, if I analyze it 15 minutes, what are the results? If I analyze just 1 minute of every 15 minutes, what are the results? What do I actually need? So also we can start to sort of do the analysis so that it's evidence-driven about what we decide to do. But I think it is important for us to start thinking about how we're actually collecting the data and what questions we actually want to ask with the data, instead of just going out and collecting data and then not really knowing or not really using all that data that we have when it has these environmental costs. I think it's something that we can all do on a kind of smaller level.
Yeah, that's a great point, Eleanor. I mean, I'm noting that down for myself. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's such an important point also about being purposeful about the data collection that we want to do, and just because we can collect more data doesn't mean we necessarily need more data. And at some point, maybe there's even kind of diminishing returns in terms of the data that we have, and being able to kind of figure out what that limit is. And like you're saying, now we should be able to now look at the past couple of years, look at the kind of data we've collected, and be able to do that analysis to be able to figure out what do we really need, how much do we really need, and then recalibrate some of the data collection efforts in line with that. And I think that the relevance of that point extends well beyond this conversation on biodiversity and conservation, but more broadly to the kind of datafication we see of our societies, and particularly we see a lot of it in the global south. I wanted to just switch gear a little bit and ask you both about the broader kind of ecosystem that you work in. International consortiums, coalitions, organizations, they all seem to be quite prominent in this space now. And both of you have worked with various collectives and worked with different partners, large kind of funding agencies. What role do you see international organizations playing in kind of setting the agenda for AI adoption and AI innovation in the context that you work in, and what might be the kind of priorities of that agenda?
So we've worked with we've had some very good international collaborations, especially with Cornell, which is a fairly a leader in some of the bird related AI development. And now one of the things I think that is really important is for the community in India to come together, because I think that bioacoustics and AI, this is something that India can actually take some leadership role in, because we definitely have the software engineers that can work on some of these questions. We have the biodiversity, certainly. So I think that some of these answers, like we are not left behind in terms of technology, like for example, the genetics or genomics kind of research that happens. Many other technology heavy research fields which require certain sophisticated equipment. But in this case, I think that India is perfectly in a right space, except that I don't think we quite realize this, and I certainly don't see a kind of push either from the government or even from varied groups across the country to come together. And we are a few of us have decided to come together, and we've proposed a center and a consortium for bioacoustics in India. I'm not sure how well that'll go. Curiously, it's not the government that's interested in this, but it seems to be the philanthropic donors and people who seem to have a little bit of vision about what the government is not able to see, and they want to invest in some things like this. So I'm excited about some of these opportunities, at least at the India level. Internationally, I'm not very sure about where we're heading.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with, I think, Robin on the wider level. I think that a lot of this work initially has been done, at least in the conservation biodiversity world, has been being led by the global north, I guess, if you will. So like the US and the UK and Europe. And that's where a lot of these technologies, like you were saying, Cornell, or like the systems that we're working with come from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK. And so I think, I mean, this is great because they've been building these systems, but they also have problems when you try and put those systems out in tropical places. They don't work so well. You need to test them for those different environments. The AI technology algorithms, like we've been saying, also don't work so well. So I think there is a real opportunity for countries in the global south, if you will, to start developing these techs and running these things themselves. And I know Singapore, for example, has recently got very into AI. So the Singapore government has a lot of funding for AI, for research, but also for businesses. And so Singapore itself is really developing. And I think within Asia or Southeast Asia, there is this opportunity now for us to develop AI for the region with the algorithms, with the tech that works within that region, and to sort of lead that and sort of the global north leading that in this region. So I think there are huge opportunities there, and I can see from what Robin was saying, and also from what I've seen in sort of Singapore and Malaysia, that there is a huge interest in this, because this region has such high biodiversity, and it also has such high loss, and is going to be affected by things like climate change very, very much so. So this is a huge opportunity, I think. But I mean, there are also these problems that we've talked about in terms of data storage and access to this. You know, if some of these systems require you to have Wi-Fi out in the middle of the field or something to load things up and these sorts of things. So I think there are problems that need to be overcome. But I think that that definitely this is a huge and exciting area, and I think there is huge interest in it moving forward as well. I guess the other thing to maybe highlight is the need for open access, right? So open access data sharing, open access agreements. So access to codes and algorithms that might have been developed elsewhere, but also the data when we're putting it up we should be sharing this data. We've got a global biodiversity crisis. It is global. If we want to tackle this, we need to be sharing this data, putting it up on open access databases so that people can be analyzing this data on global scales and using to help tackle this crisis. So I think the need for the recognition of being more open in global sharing as well is really important.
Thanks, Eleanor. What will it take to kind of help advance the vision or some of the points that you're raising, right? Like, what would be some of the enablers that we need to kind of activate in the region, whether it's around financing or maybe it's around kind of data licensing, so that as we make these open access, we also ensure that they are being used for the preservation of biodiversity and not kind of being misused for other kind of commercial purposes, or whether it's kind of knowledge sharing, which you touched upon in the beginning at the start of the podcast. So what are some of the enablers that we need to kind of activate in the region to be able to kind of leverage some of the benefits that you both are talking about?
Yeah, I think at least with the perspective that I have, I definitely think financing there's a big role to play, because for a lot of these things, whether it is storage of data and getting the data and all of these, you need some investment. But I think that, there's an opportunity, just going back to what Eleanor was also saying, that usual problems with AI is that, it's developed somewhere else, there's context is not there, and then some of the solutions or the problems that we're looking for are somewhere else. And here, actually, we do have an opportunity where both the development and the solution can be, they can go hand in hand. They can be in the same place. So there is a little bit more involved development of some of these solutions that are possible. There needs to be a little bit more outreach, because I think that it's not that there are not enough people who are willing to put their heads together. It's just that many people have the skills, but they don't know that they can come together for some of these issues. So I'm hoping that this podcast will also, kind of function in that way, that it can kind of pull some people who are willing to put some time and effort together, which is a little beyond money, right? I mean, there needs to be some motivation to want to solve some problems that have a larger goal in some sense.
Yeah, I similarly hope this podcast can catalyze that kind of action and kind of solidarity amongst different groups. Eleanor, any kind of final words from you on the steps that we need to kind of activate the agenda that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that Robin was just saying, that, I mean, financing is important. And I think that is beginning to come particularly for this sort of tech and AI sort of side of things. People are very interested in this now. There needs to be the political will to do it, right? It needs to be driven, so that it needs to be that this is something that's on the agenda in universities. We know there's biodiversity decline. We want to get people researching this. We want to train the next generation in this. We want to give them those skills and come together, like Robin was saying, from lots of different angles as well, right? So biodiversity decline and conservation and AI, all of these things that, you have computing and software engineering, you have social sciences, you have the biological sciences. So it is a very interdisciplinary field. People need to come together and not just work in the silos. But I mean, I guess my final point would be going back to what I said at the beginning, that it's great to have all of this sort of engagement now in tech and AI and stuff, and I think this can really advance our monitoring of biodiversity. But we do need to have also that investment in basic science. We need to have that investment in basic natural history, taxonomy, training, entomologists, ornithologists, this next generation. And that's been lost a bit because we're all about the tech and the modeling. And to do the tech and the modeling well, we need to have that basic science. So that needs to be recognized, and there needs to be investment in that, both in terms of person power and training the next generation, but also financially and political will, that is what we need, right? And so I think for me, that is the most important thing. I see the interest, the excitement, the financial investment in tech, and I think that's great. But I think we really do need to have that similar excitement and recognition and investment in field biologists and people on the ground who are who are actually able to help train all these models and new tech that we have as well.
That's fantastic, Eleanor. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that also gives us such a kind of concrete or reminder of the work that really needs to be done, and also gives us a kind of concrete agenda for action and for next steps. So thank you both for sharing your work with us. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. I know I certainly have. I, on one hand, have left from this conversation feeling also a lot more optimistic about AI than sometimes I do, in terms of some of the really interesting kind of use cases for biodiversity, conservation, science communication, and also kind of bringing people closer together with nature and sparking that interest, particularly maybe amongst young people. And at the same time, I also, from this conversation, it reinforces some of the thinking and work that we've been doing also on really kind of making those investments in basic science, in education, in some of the the analog aspects of the digital infrastructure that we're building, and we can't really kind of leapfrog over those. So thank you both very much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. We'll be back next month with more conversations at the intersection of climate change and artificial intelligence in Asia. Don't forget to subscribe and do sign up for our monthly newsletter at codegreen.asia. I'm Urvashi Aneja, and on behalf of Digital Futures Lab, thank you for listening.